I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source in the spell of Henry David Thoreau. In 1854, when the escaped slave Anthony Burns was captured in Boston and returned in chains to slave owners in Virginia, despite riotous resistance on the dock in Boston, Thoreau himself was shattered. At last, it occurred to me, he wrote, that what I had lost was a country. Question comes, what would Thoreau say today if he learned that hard workers and taxpayers of long standing in this country and his state were being locked up and deported for want of immigration papers? Our guest Lewis Hyde says Thoreau would blame us, citizens, for the failure of our country and our Commonwealth to keep all its residents safe and secure in their adopted communities, regardless of their immigration status. Welcome back, Lewis Hyde. We know you as a one-of-a-kind wisdom writer on the widest range of subjects, and a man deep into Thoreau, who's all the rage again with Ken Burns' series on PBS, called this conversation we're going to have Thoreau Meets ICE, and stares it down with the highest of traditional American values. Where do you suppose Thoreau would begin?
I think he would begin, as you say, with the obligation of the Commonwealth to protect its residents. So he has this very angry essay he wrote in response to the Anthony Burns affair called Slavery in Massachusetts. And one thing in it is kind of odd for Thoreau because we think of him as a no-government man, or at least a least government man.
Yep.
But in fact, what he does is to invoke two Massachusetts state laws, which, if they had been obeyed, might have helped protect Anthony Burns from his rendition. And these were what were called personal liberty laws. All the northern states had them before the Civil War. They were laws meant to protect free blacks and alleged fugitives. In Massachusetts, the two that Thoreau mentions, one's from the 1830s, and it was a law that said a fugitive slave should be given a jury trial. In Massachusetts, if you gave him a jury trial, he might well go free. The second one was a later law from the 1840s, which was really a non-cooperation law. It said that citizens and officials of the state of Massachusetts did not have to cooperate with the rendition of slaves. Come back to your question now, Chris. If Thoreau meets ICE, what can the states do? I guess in the background is the question, can the state put any limits on federal power?
There's news in this wonderful article you've written on the subject, and that is that sovereignty in the 19th century America, even in the Constitution as was written, was a double sovereignty. There was the federal sovereignty and state rights too, and not just on the question of slavery or not slavery, but on all manner of contributing rights. As you say, jury trial for somebody charged with almost any kind of offense, but also the freedom of the states not to cooperate in what the feds were doing.
The dual sovereignty that exists in our country is written into the Constitution. There's a wonderful essay by James Madison, one of the Federalist Papers, where he explains this. He says the Constitution, which was at that time being debated, should we have this or not, he says the Constitution does not create a national government. What it does is to create a federal government with certain enumerated powers, and then everything else is left to the states. And the states then have an inviolable sovereignty over everything else. So if you reframe that in terms of the fight over slavery, you could say that the northern states were claiming a sovereignty to protect the civil rights of free blacks, whereas, of course, the southern states were claiming a sovereignty to own slaves. As for which one prevails, before the Civil War, the northern states had the problem that there was, in fact, a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. So you want to claim that free blacks have civil rights, and when it gets adjudicated in the courts, you're up against the fact that there's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution. I've been surprised how many of my well-educated friends do not know this.
I'm one of them.
Yeah. Well, the clause says something like, it's phrased euphemistically, anyone who has an obligation of labor to somebody and escapes into another state is to be returned to that person to whom the obligation is due. So this was a compromise entry into the Constitution that the southern states insisted on. So we have the problem, you can say all you want about the civil rights of fugitive slaves, but the Constitution trumps that. These, what are called personal liberty laws, which tried to give civil rights to slaves and free blacks, were eventually challenged in court. And when the court case got all the way to the Supreme Court, Justice Joseph Story said all those laws are unconstitutional. He threw them out. They're null and void because the Fugitive Slave Clause established a universal right not bound by any territory, couldn't be trumped by any state legislature. So when Madison argues that there will be dual sovereignty, there's something behind it that's worth teasing out, which is that the founding fathers of this nation were very wary of power. They thought power was insatiable as the grave, that power, you give power to a human being, and that human being will keep trying to increase their power. And they were thinking about monarchs. They were thinking about the kings of England and France and so forth. And so their solution, very cunning, was to divide power against itself. There's a wonderful line from Justice Anthony Kennedy. He says, the founders split the atom of sovereignty.
Yeah.
And they split it two ways. The one we know best is they split it into the judiciary, legislature, and executive. These three branches are actually supposed to fight with each other. We've lost that, but that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to have disagreements and work it out amongst themselves so there's no central power. But they split it also into state and federal. I like to call this a diarchy. As opposed to a monarchy, there's monarchy, one power, diarchy, two, triarchy, three. And the diarchy and the triarchy, they are there to try to destroy the monarchy of their youth. And this is an argument that has come up today. When we do the No King's March, that's the heritage we're trying to bring to the surface. And the current authoritarian oligarchy has managed to eat away at the triarchy. And whether the diarchy can survive is a question. But these days, I hold it up as one of the faint hopes of drawing the line against the unitary power that Trump and his people so desperately want.
I love that phrasing of it. I also want to hear a revival of an adversarial society where almost any of these fundamental things, not to mention war powers abroad, has to be put to and must instinctively want to be put to a test of difference. What exactly are we getting into? For how long? And when? Against whom? At the side of whom? We don't talk about these things. It's a giant mystery.
Well, to have adversarial conversations, you need to have some rules of the road.
Yeah.
You need to have some practice
Exactly.
in adversarial
Experience.
discussion.
Players, respected practitioners.
And at the head of the line right now, we have somebody who deals entirely in insults. If somebody disagrees with him, it's a stupid lunatic. There's no ethic or even talent or interest in true adversarial discussion. But yes, we need to reclaim that.
Your friend and mine, Henry David Thoreau, would have imagined that there was plenty of room in that state sovereignty to hold the line on fundamental human rights and also due process, just for starters, in order to protect communities of trust from what you're calling the theater of cruelty that we see today. Is that enforceable?
You know, when Madison said that the states have an inviolable sovereignty, he also said there's a problem here. We have two jurisdictions, and they're sometimes going to get into fights. And ideally, there will be a tribunal of some sort which will adjudicate these fights and figure them out. That has turned out to be the Supreme Court. He adds, however, that if the fights can't be adjudicated, they're going to lead, perhaps, to the sword and to disunion.
Right.
That is, if this can't be solved, if the conflict between the two sovereignties can't be solved, you're going to find yourself in a war or splitting up the union. It's a warning in Madison's Federalist Papers saying we've set up this dual sovereignty and there's a problem with it, which if we can't solve conflicts between the two, there's going to be a war.
There's going to be,
or it'll break up the union.
It's a very prescient warning, right?
I think he was more optimistic. I mean, he was trying to say, so let's take seriously the fact that we try to solve these. However, there it is. He says that. And by the time you get to the 1850s, Thoreau is on the side of, okay, let's have a war, let's have disunion. I mean, I'm not kidding. The Slavery in Massachusetts is a bellicose essay in which he leans toward let's have a fight about this.
Right. No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. And that fugitive slave law of the 1850s on the federal books, it just drove Thoreau kind of up the wall. My thoughts on the fugitive slave law, he said, are murder to the state. But I'm just wondering, would Thoreau make the leap you make, Lewis, that the transportation of fugitive slaves is the historical equivalent of what we're seeing in the roughshod immigration enforcement in Trump time? ICE, in short.
I do make this analogy.
Explain how it suddenly dawned on you that
Well,
the immigrants being thrown out are, in effect, the fugitive slaves.
I mean, again, we have a population among us whose rights are not clear. That is, immigrants, particularly without papers, it's not entirely clear what their rights are, how they find them. The same was true, obviously, with fugitive slaves. And again, we have a government which is willing to try to punish them, to, put them back in chains or send them out of the country. So I guess for anybody who cares about the human dignity of those populations, the puzzle is how to find a purchase from which to resist the federal government's desire to remand slaves or to deport immigrants.
And more broadly, just refuse to recognize them as human beings in our midst.
The refusal to recognize them as human beings, I think, brings us back to that thing you began with, that Thoreau suddenly feels that he's lost his country.
Yeah.
He thought he was living in a country where the dignity of each human was recognized. And if we can jump to the present moment, this is a feeling that many of us have now. A case that, to my mind, seems similar to what happened with Anthony Burns is the attempted deportation of Ramusa Öztürk, this Turkish woman who was studying at Tufts. Let's just spell out for a second what happened. She was a co-signer of an op-ed which spoke about Palestinian rights in a way that many people might disagree with, but nonetheless, it's not seditious, it's not a terrorist utterance. A group called Canary Mission, which seems to have self-appointed itself to seek out people who might be plausibly anti-Semitic, submitted her name to the federal government saying, watch out for this lady. And the State Department then decided to revoke her visa and deport her. They didn't tell her they'd done this. They didn't tell Tufts University they'd done this. Masked men showed up in Somerville in an unmarked car, jumped out, took her off the street, put her in shackles, wouldn't tell her why they had arrested her, drove her first to Vermont, then flew her to Louisiana, all within 24 hours, telling nobody where she was. Basically put her in an abusive prison situation for 45 days. So this is not my country. A year later, they finally get the action memo from the State Department that described what they were trying to do. There was nothing in it that indicated any illegal activity on the part of this woman. So, here we have basically a kind of secret police reporting other citizens and residents and taking them off the street. If that's the state, if I'm looking at a video of this and think, that's my state in action, I suddenly think, that's not my state. That's not my country. I find myself as enraged as Thoreau was enraged.
In the case of the Öztürk woman, the student at Tufts, it turned out there was nothing she had done that was illegal, and there was nothing surely that exceeded her rights of free speech in this country, which comes with the country, not with the speech or the person making it. It just reminds me of the law, I believe, that if an undocumented immigrant is driving a car too fast and gets pulled over for speeding, the cop cannot ask that person, show me your papers, or do you have citizenship, or be taking the occasion to look for an immigration violation. Is that right?
So you're talking about what are called sanctuary policies.
Exactly.
I think that sanctuary policies are the heirs of the non-cooperation personal liberty laws from the 1850s. In both cases, the main modifier of their verbs is not. You will not check people's papers. You will not ask them about their citizenship. In the 1850s, you will not help remand a slave. You will not let people use local jails to hold the slave. And why not? Because experience and common decency have shown that building trust and having common purpose are a better way to ensure the health, the freedom, the economic viability of a town or city. You want people to not be afraid to go to church, to not be afraid to send their children to school. You don't want them to be afraid to go to the hospital. If they're sick with a communicable disease,
Yep.
you don't want to have created a community of fear where they will not show up and instead spread the disease. On the side of police enforcement, you want the police to be able to spend the tax dollars that pay them on local crimes, not get involved in what is in fact the government's problem. Sanctuary policies all over the country make a distinction. They say, you will not do this, you will not do that, except if somebody shows up with a criminal warrant. That is to say, they give no sanctuary to actual criminals. If somebody's robbed a bank, no sanctuary policy will keep anybody from trying to catch the guy and putting him in jail. And behind this lies an important distinction, which is between civil and criminal infractions. Civil infractions are more minor things like a speeding ticket, parking ticket, jaywalking. These are civil problems. Immigration violations are also civil problems. They are not criminal. Somebody who is in the country without proper papers has a civil infraction, not a criminal infraction. So sanctuary policies say the enforcement of civil immigration policy is a federal problem. This is true under the Constitution. It's not a state or local problem. In fact, if states try to write their own immigration laws, the Supreme Court strikes them down. It's a federal problem. The states and cities say, we'll stay in our lane. We don't have to help you hunt down people who have civil violations. You can request help from us, and sometimes we'll give it, but you can't demand it. In fact, when this gets to the Supreme Court, the court has said that the federal government cannot command a state to undertake its own enforcement policies. Anton Scalia, the conservative justice, made that clear. The federal government cannot force the states to administer a federal program.
We're talking about states and the federal government with respect to slavery in the 1850s. We're talking about specifically immigration standards in the 2020s. Let's stick with linking those two.
The link that's of interest to me is the matter of how the Constitution authorizes or does not authorize what's going on. So in the 1850s, again, we had the problem that there was a fugitive slave clause. So when the president sends troops to Boston, and friends and neighbors, Boston was an occupied city in 1854 with federal marshals and Marines and a federalized state militia helping march Mr. Burns to the wharf. When the president does this, he can find a basis for his action in the Constitution. Okay, now let's jump to the present moment. Trump would like to commandeer the National Guard and send it into cities. Trump would like to sue to quash sanctuary policies. What does he find in the Constitution that allows him to do these things? Well, he goes on a kind of wild goose chase. He finds, for example, that it's the duty of the president to protect the states from invasion. So then he announces that there's an invasion at the southern border.
Right.
In some cases, it allows the president to act if there's a rebellion. And anytime there's a demonstration against ICE, he declares that this is a rebellion. And then everything is an emergency. You know, there's a crime emergency in D.C., and there's an emergency in Texas.
He has declared some of these emergencies.
He declares everything an emergency because it allows him to quickly act. When he commandeers the National Guard of California, these are the bases upon which he claims he's allowed to do it. Now, the fact is that then the governor of California takes him to court. And what the court finds is there was no invasion. There is no rebellion. And in fact, under the 10th Amendment, the state of California has the right to control its own National Guard. This gets up to the Supreme Court, which in a typically narrow ruling agrees. So in the 19th century, the president had the right under the Constitution to get involved in the remanding of slaves. Today, nothing in the Constitution allows the federal government so far to commandeer the National Guards.
Is it clear, Lewis Hyde, in this federalized realm of layered dual sovereignties, is it clear who controls the National Guard? Isn't that a critical question?
It's a congressional power to be able to call up the National Guard. It's not a presidential power. But the Congress at one point delegated some of that power to the president, allowing the president to call them up when, for example, there's a rebellion. So in this moment, Trump has no power to call up the National Guard because there is no rebellion. So let's say for now, the National Guard belongs to the states. And the National Guards statewide get used if there's real civic unrest, the National Guard can be brought in. And it also gets used if there's a national disaster of some kind and you need people on the ground who can help. The National Guard gets called up to help. You know, it's a local service group with some enforcement powers. I think the state of Massachusetts, the Attorney General has indicated that we will not allow National Guards from other states to come into Massachusetts. That's a question. I mean, sometimes when Trump has been unable to find a National Guard, he calls the people from Texas, who apparently are happy to go anywhere.
Let's take it from the Thoreau side. Help Henry David Thoreau look for alternative bases, his kind of basis, to assert the state sensibility in the state sovereignty to protect people in general from cruel and unusual punishment, for example, which certainly were inflicted on the poor Tufts woman, sending her here, there, and everywhere without a single offense. Where else could Thoreau say, no, you're violating personal liberty laws that we've enacted in Massachusetts or sanctuary policies that make every sense?
Well, there are two levels of this. What's interesting about the essay Slavery in Massachusetts is that he does appeal to the law, to the state law. There were two laws which would have helped Anthony Burns. They were not obeyed. And Thoreau and his fellow transcendentalists also imagined that there was something called higher law, which is not written in any state constitution and not written in the U.S. Constitution. He says, don't look at the Constitution that you find written in your handbook. Look at the Constitution in your own soul and decide whether this is a thing you can or cannot do.
Good for him. Could he assert a right to, for example, protection by the state of people and their communities from fear or from isolation or from violations of trust? Or could you protect them from anybody blocking their access to churches or hospitals?
Well, his line is that the laws that people respect are laws that they feel make sense to them, that are in accord with their own sense of morality. So yeah, there could be laws that do that, and we do have such laws. But they reserve the right to say if you can't find that law, or if the law you're looking at violates your own conscience, you draw the line. Now, I should say that there's a long debate then over what nonviolent action in this kind of case means. And I would say that if you want to claim there's a higher law and break the local law, you should be willing to take the punishment. That is, you don't do this in secret. You don't get the posse together and start killing people because you disagree with the law. You stand up publicly and face it. You know, Thoreau's night in jail is exemplary because he drew the line and took the punishment. And both his heirs, Gandhi and King, did the same thing. But that's, for them, how you begin to really question, you know, to have the presence of higher law in your own actions and have your actions call out the presence of higher law in other people. They hope to speak to the conscience of their neighbors.
Didn't people in Minnesota do just that, in fact?
The people in Minnesota began to act as neighbors to one another.
Yes.
And say, we as a community do not accept the way you are enacting, you know, these laws. Maybe they make sense, but what you're doing is not making sense. It seems to be cruel, and it seems to be inciting fear. And if fear-mongering and cruelty are your method, we disagree, and we're going to deliver food to people who are scared to come out of their houses, and we're going to drive them to the hospital if they feel they're sick, and we're not going to cooperate. At
the state level, Lewis, who's to enforce for us those reasonable protections?
Well, I mean, what many states are trying to do now, and this is modern state sovereignty, modern states' rights, they're trying to pass laws within the narrow limits of their own sovereignty to address these. For example, several states now have anti-masking laws.
Yes.
I say when you come in and pick people off the street with masks, that's insulting and should be illegal. And there's going to be a fight about this, but California, for example, has an anti-masking law. Minnesota had an anti-masking law, which was not being obeyed. The state of Illinois has passed a law saying citizens can sue and immigrants can sue ICE agents for violating their civil rights. So states can pass laws, and the state law enforcement can try to enforce them that beef up the protections, which in a way we thought were there, because normatively we don't go around picking up people off the street with masks. But we see people doing that now, so we try to make it illegal.
How many states in the country, Lewis Hyde, have sanctuary laws that can assure citizens that they will not be assaulted or abused walking down the street, that they don't have to be afraid of arbitrary process?
So the number is a little obscure. The Trump people said that the Justice Department should make a list, and they could then go after them. The Justice Department list has 18 states. But to that you have to add, there are counties and cities also. There's a total of about 34 jurisdictions which have sanctuary policies. And I should say these policies don't guarantee that there won't be fear mongering and cruelty. In fact, the problem right now is that once ICE comes in and terrifies everybody, your sanctuary policy is kind of moot, because it takes a long time to build trust and community goodwill, and it takes very short time to destroy it, and then a long time to build it up again. So it's a lot of states and jurisdictions would have it. Curiously, to my mind, Massachusetts is not on that list. But the new law that's being debated right now in our legislature, it's not called it, but in fact, if you read the language of it, it seems to me it's also a sanctuary policy. It says that state officials shall not ask anybody about their immigration status or their citizenship. And that's one of the key pieces of a sanctuary policy, that those matters are not state matters, they're federal matters. So let's try as a state to make people feel comfortable, unless they commit a crime, in which case we arrest them. This is not about protecting criminals.
Who is it to protect?
Sanctuary policies are there to protect immigrants, documented or not. Sanctuary policies are there to try to build communities of trust. If there's an undocumented immigrant in your community, eventually that should be dealt with. It's not that these are trying to make safe havens for undocumented people. It's let's believe in one another and proceed. Again, to be undocumented in this country, what does it actually mean? I had a friend whose husband, before they were married, had come over from England. He was an engineer. He was working in this country, and he overstayed his visa. He gets a letter from the immigration people saying, we'd like to know what boat you're leaving on and when it leaves. And so they got married. But, that's a typical case of an undocumented person. He's overstayed his visa. Sometimes you have people who are asylum seekers, that if they go back to El Salvador, they're liable to be killed, and their asylum petition has not yet been approved. So that's plausibly undocumented. You need to be able to tease out all the complexity of this. Under Obama and Biden, undocumented immigrants were deported. There's a humane way to do this. The Trump program is not really about undocumented immigrants. It's about fear-mongering and cruelty. It's a performative thing. It's about power. Behind it lies somebody who is trying to assert his power and dominance and make sure that everybody knows it. So when they arrest Osmeda Ozturk in Somerville, it's partly about her case, but it's more about now every foreign student in Massachusetts needs to be afraid.
How, in the spirit of Henry David Thoreau, are you going to make that impossible?
If you're Thoreau, you ring the town bell and you get up and give a speech that lays out the story and why it matters. I've written a 25-page essay about this in which I try to understand what happened in the 1850s and understand what's happening now. And writing that essay has kept me sane for the last 6 months. Because, our choice right now is to either ignore what's going on, and so we're blind to the facts, or else be a powerless person who absorbs the moral injury of your powerlessness. Most of us are caught between those two things. We're either going to ignore this, or we're going to be constantly hurt by the fact that we have no leverage about things we see and disagree with. So for me, being able to write this essay and read the paper every day and see, okay, this is a piece I can use, that's a piece I can use, it's kept me sane.
That's a gift.
Well, you speak up anyway, and each of us has different ways of speaking up. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a writer, so I write.
The opportunity here, I think, Lewis Hyde, is to unfold not just the law, but Henry David Thoreau's mentality, his spirit. He's one of the great American founding writers and spirit definers of what is special about this country, and he felt these values passionately. When the federal government remanded Anthony Burns to his slave state in Virginia, Thoreau said with a broken heart that he had lost his country. You're arguing, Lewis Hyde, that the deportation of people with suspect immigration papers is the moral equivalent in our time of that outrage. How would you and Thoreau remind us of the values that completely reject that spirit?
So what would Thoreau do? Thoreau had two lives, really. The basic one was his love and interest in nature.
Yes.
And one thing that makes him mad about the fugitive slave problem is that it distracts him from what he actually likes to do. And his other life is as a writer, and writing about nature, but he also writes about politics. He's a brilliant writer. His writing works today as it worked in the past. So what would he do? He would write. He would lay out clearly in American prose what's at stake and how to respond to it.
And we're dying to hear it.
So those of us now who are writers, that's our job. I would say one other thing, though, about Thoreau, which is people think of him as a nonviolent activist, but he was not. Thoreau was willing to use violence. In the Anthony Burns case in slavery in Massachusetts, he's upset that the state militia in Massachusetts went over to help remand the slave. Thoreau felt the state militia should have fought with Marines the federal government had sent in.
Exactly.
When John Brown raided Harper's Ferry, Thoreau said, "This is great. Finally, rifles and pistols are being used for the right cause." He was not afraid of violence. He would have turned to violence at a moment's notice. I say this because this is not what should happen now. It's absolutely imperative that the resistance to Trump's programs be nonviolent. So instead of Thoreau, we need to turn to his heirs, to Gandhi first and to Martin Luther King, who both found in their spiritual traditions an addition to add to nonviolent resistance. In Gandhi, in the Hindu scriptures, a thing called ahimsa is a high virtue, and it means non-harming. It means non-harming to the degree that if you're mad at somebody, you don't even think of hurting them in response to the hurt they've given you. And of course, Martin Luther King has turned to the Bible. So these are great models for how to respond to overwhelming power that opposes you. And at this moment, the power of the federal government is beyond knowing. And partly what the Trump people like to do is to see if they can provoke a responsive violence to their violence and then double down.
Can I add one more thing about Thoreau? He went out of his way not to identify himself in a community. He saw himself as a creature of nature, and that had the higher claim on his hierarchy of values. And I think that comes in here too. He's not looking for just the law. He's looking to look at human nature, human history, human experience, and human values to give him the real rule. Is that part of the way you see him reaching out from the law and the regulation on immigration to a higher law in nature, perhaps, of conservation of a community, respect for families and people as they are?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, first of all, the fact that Trump and his administration deny climate change and are actively involved in undermining any attempt to respond to the climate crisis is of a piece with their immigration policy. Somehow it's in the same mindset. They're not cruel just to men and women undocumented. They're cruel to the trees and they're cruel to the lakes. I think Thoreau's isolation from his community is exaggerated. He was an isolato. He liked to just go out and walk alone. He liked to identify with nature more than with his fellow townsmen. But the opposite is also true. He was a highly social person. I mean, first of all, writing a book is a highly social act. Secondly, he, lectured regularly. He belonged to the Lyceum. He was the Lyceum chairman for some years. You learn from the Ken Burns show right now that he would have the local anti-slavery community come down and give speeches in front of his cabin. he sought the community of like-minded people who believed in the things he believed in, and it gave him strength. So he would do both. He would turn to nature, and he would turn to his fellow man and women.
Right.
I think Thoreau was interested in asking people the deep questions.
Yeah.
What do you believe in? Do you feel that nature is sacred? He would ask the questions that matter. He would challenge you about, do you think Christianity is the only viable spiritual system? He said, I've been reading the Bhagavad Gita. It seems pretty good to me. He would pester you about what you believe in. And if you're a person who is actually interested in being a seeker, I think you would love to have him as a friend.
But aren't you suggesting he would reject citizenship laws or identities altogether?
I think probably. I think, he thinks of himself as an American, but it's the American of its ideals. And again, when he says you don't turn to the Constitution that's written down, you turn to the Constitution in your own heart. He did believe that America was an unusual institution, that it had been founded with high hopes and ideals worth striving for. But I think to the degree that America fails, he's not interested in being an American anymore. So it's the ideals come first.
Right. And he would not be a citizen of any country that tolerated and enforced slavery. That was what put him in jail originally, or led him not to pay his taxes that put him in jail. I'm also wondering if that doesn't obliterate his standing on the question. Well, you just don't believe in citizenship, Mr. Thoreau.
This has been the American style of speaking ever since the founding, which is that there's an America of the future. There's an America which we will someday belong to. And that's the America I pledge allegiance to. And it's the America in which all humans are created equal. And so it's the America of its ideals. And to the degree that we fail at those ideals, it's not America anymore. And it's not my country. There's a prophetic strain to Thoreau.
Amen.
Prophetic meaning speaking to the high ideals which should be true in all time. They should be true now, and if they aren't, then you look around to see why they aren't, and you hope they will be true in the future. He belongs to the prophetic America.
Yeah.
At the end of Slavery in Massachusetts, Thoreau has a passage where he invokes the white water lily in the Concord River, which blooms fragrantly, though its roots are stuck in mud. And it's a kind of invocation of hope. Out of the dirt at the bottom of the river comes something beautiful at the top. I also think it's a mistake, rhetorically. I think that's not the right ending for his essay. Things were dire in the 1850s, and it wasn't time for transcendental cheer. And things are dire now, too. They're dire in different ways, but dire. Partly because the attack on any attempt to have sanctuary, which means communities of trust, has been so aggressive. Wherever ICE has gone into a community and done its job, trust has been destroyed. It takes a long time to build trust. It will probably not come back in my lifetime. And also, this attack on immigrants, behind that, I think immigration is not really the point. The point is power. If Trump runs out of immigrants, he'll find some other target to harass, and the theater of cruelty will just continue. The great leaders of liberation movements in the 19th century, Gandhi and King, they both made the daring assumption that you can stir the conscience of a nation through your nonviolent actions. King said of Gandhi once that he had the luck that the Brits had some degree of moral conscience. And King himself used to appeal to the conscience of millions of white Americans. So I stand in awe of the face of these men, but my own faith has been shaken. I am haunted by a remark by Nadezhda Mandelstam, the widow of the poet. She's living under the Stalinist terror in the 1930s, and she says, "Strange to say, but the word conscience has gone out of ordinary use." To wake and school the conscience of a nation is a long-term affair, and this country seems to be chaos-weary and ready to sleep. The current oligarchy has been eating away at the divisions of power that the framers tried to put in place. And whether the sovereignty promised to the states is truly inviolable and can hold the line is something we have yet to know.
Thank you, Lewis Hyde. It's a great privilege to be able to call on a man who is inspired by Thoreau, thinks like Thoreau, has learned a lot about writing just from reading Thoreau. This has been fun.
And for me too, Chris. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and have you tease my brain until things come out.
Lewis Hyde is best known for his classic little book, The Gift, on how art gets made. His essay, ICE and Our Immigrants, Lessons from the Abolitionists, is forthcoming in the summer issue of Liberties, the Quarterly. Thoreau's essay, Slavery in Massachusetts, can be found in Lewis Hyde's Milkweed edition of the Essays of Henry David Thoreau. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, please go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest-running podcast going strong. We're proud to be founding members of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent voices in podcasting. Check the range of our interests, art to technology to politics and history, at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did. And thank you.